Welcome back to SunScream. Tonight's guest is Andy Davidson, author of In the Valley of the Sun and The Boatman's Daughter. Thank you for joining us tonight. My guest is Andy Davidson. Welcome, Andy.
Thanks for having me.
So you're joining us from Georgia?
Yes. Cochran, Georgia.
Cochran, Georgia. Now, where in Georgia is Cochran?
Cochran is about 40 minutes southeast of Macon, which is about 50 minutes south of Atlanta.
Okay.
So Cochran's in that magic sort of zone of like it's 2 hours from Atlanta, it's 2 hours from the coast, it's 2 hours from Florida, it's 2 hours from Alabama, it's 2 hours from everywhere.
I was actually in Madison, Rutledge, and Savannah this past week.
Oh wow, yeah.
And I lived in Milledgeville for a year, so I was curious which part of Georgia you were finding yourself in.
We're pretty close to Milledgeville. It's about an hour up the road. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we've been there several times.
What prompted the move from Arkansas to Georgia?
Actually, I was in Mississippi when I moved to Georgia. I had gone to graduate school in Mississippi from Arkansas, and I had kind of played out my time in Mississippi. I had graduated from the program in 2004 and taught online as an instructor for the university for 3 years. So basically, I got a sense of the wind changing, and with the respect to how they were handling their online teaching, and I started looking for a job and found one down here in Georgia, and sure enough heard within a year that like all the satellite instructors that I had been working with had been fired. So I got out while the getting was good.
So in terms of that, then are you full-time writing now? What's
I wish I were, but no, I'm actually still teaching. I teach at Middle Georgia State University. I'm teaching creative writing and I'm teaching composition. So
okay, I think I actually knew that somewhere in my index of my brain.
Yeah, and that's good too, because I teach online a lot, but I still have some classroom classes as well, and every now and then, and most of those are creative writing, so I get to interact with students who are young writers, and that's always fun.
Are you hoping to achieve that sort of Toni Morrison status where you teach one graduate course a year?
I would say I'm more hoping to achieve that Dean Koontz status where I don't have to teach any classes, so
okay.
But no, I it is fun. I enjoy it, but the heart wants what the heart wants.
I feel you. I teach my 6 classes a year myself.
Yeah. I'm my load is I'm actually just an instructor, so my load is like 5 I want to say every semester.
Oh, geez.
Yeah.
That's
right.
A lot of classes. 5 is a lot of classes, man.
It is a lot of classes. But yeah, it's good.
Especially reading, writing.
No, and you find that as a writer, reading student essays over and over again, and especially in composition, definitely kind of dulls your brain a little bit because you read the same topics over and over again. Most freshman students are writing on one of 10 things, and so you have to kind of make your lists and tell them, don't write about this, don't write about this. So yeah.
Do you have sort of anybody doing high fantasy, low fantasy, dark fantasy kind of stuff?
Some. I teach my creative writing classes with a bent toward genre. That is not necessarily the way some of my colleagues do it, but that's okay. It's just where my interests lie. And so yeah, I do have students who take me knowing that and want to write fantasy. They want to write a young adult novel. They want to write horror stories, which is really good because all of my lessons and assignments are kind of geared toward that anyway. So I kind of like to force the exploration of genre within the context of trying to write a quote unquote literary story. So all of the things that we would teach in a writing program, I like to teach that in the context of genre.
Now, in terms of those overarching labels, right? Where do you think you fall? Do you think you fall in the dark fantasy, or do you think you're more of a horror, or do you think you're somewhere nebulously in between?
I think of myself as a horror writer, and that's like if I had to self-identify, I would say I'm a horror writer.
Mm.
I know that um, the way that labels get applied is often related to marketing. So, with my uh, second book, Boatman's Daughter, that was a supernatural thriller, I think was the
Yeah.
way it was put, and it's also a gothic, and so there's a lot of like Southern Gothic, and so there's a lot of playing around with the way you call a thing.
Hmm.
And in my case, I like to just say it's a horror novel. Um, and definitely as I get into like future projects, I'm trying to kind of even get more and more into you can't call it like I'm backing the publisher into a corner. It has to be a horror novel. You
Okay.
can't call it something else. So, which they're actually happy to. My editor at MCD is also an acquiring editor for Tor and Nightfire, and that's their new horror label that they are putting a lot of, I guess, momentum behind this fall with a bunch of releases that are coming out. I don't know if you know about that or heard.
I've
Yeah,
I have a stack of things that are on my radar, and sometimes they get kind of confused. Um, Also confused with my own sort of stuff, if that makes any sense.
yeah,
Um,
sure.
so there's all these different publishing things that are jumbling around in my brain.
Well, yeah, if I were able to turn my monitor, you'd see over here I have my to read cart, and it's just chock full of things that are they fantasy, are they horror, are they science fiction, they're thrillers, what are they? And a lot of that is people that I know, like that I are in circles of publishing that I've met through social media or conferences way back when, and so yeah, yeah, there's a lot out there that's multi-genre. Yeah.
Well, I mean, because the thriller genre pops up late 80s really to sell people horror books that they don't want to call horror books, like
Yeah,
sell
it was
Thomas Harris's books.
right. I was going to say it was Silence of the Lambs that changed the game there in the, was that 89, 90,
Mhm.
somewhere like that. Yeah, they started calling that a thriller, and technically, yeah, I guess you could make the case that that's a horror novel. Pretty straightforward.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the film, right, we wouldn't call the film a thriller by any,
No, yeah. Which
right?
is interesting. Like I wouldn't, but didn't it won Best Picture at the
Mhm.
Oscars that year? And
Yeah, 91.
yeah, and so when Get Out was nominated for Best Picture a few years back, I don't think Get Out won. Is that right? Or did Get Out win? I don't
I
remember.
don't think Get Out won.
Anyway, that there was a big deal made around that as like one of the first horror films to break through into that category of
Which was wrong
academy
too, because The Shape of
academy
Water did
recognition.
win.
Right, right. And the Shape of Water is one of those interesting movies. Like, is that a horror film? Is it a fantasy? Is it a romance? What is it? And it's all those things. And that's one of the things with my classes and my students that I try to really kind of emphasize is that calling a thing one thing is just a way to sell a thing. It's not a way to really talk about a thing or identify a thing and know what a book is or a story.
Absolutely. I think The Shape of Water is horror. I would classify it there. I've gotten into the debate with people about Get Out, whether it's a horror movie or not. I mean, it clearly is.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of the problem there too is Jordan Peele was calling it multiple things at different times.
Yeah.
But I'm
Which
sure.
again is probably just that's part of like the way that you get the biggest audience. That's and again, in my publisher, like one of the reasons they wanted to call The Boatman's Daughter a supernatural thriller is so that it would have a wider audience.
Hmm.
I've met people that have that prejudice that they carry about horror, and in fact, I met a very dear, sweet lady at a book club for my first book, a book club event in the Valley of the Sun. And I was sort of standing at the door shaking hands with people as they came in. And she shook my hand and she said, "Oh, you're the one with the deranged mind." So So there is that perception that that's what horror is everyone who writes horror must be, crazy or deranged or morbid, or goes all the way back to like students talking about Edgar Allan Poe in in ways that it's like, no, not quite.
We
But
get that a lot too, because we originally called the program Nights of Horror, and
mhm.
people were like, "Oh, I don't like horror," and it's like, well,
So you rebranded.
yeah, we rebranded partial. Well, we rebranded because there was other things called Nights of Horror as well,
Right.
and then we had to do the thing where we like claimed every social media account in and around it, kind of deal, which that was nightmarish. Um, and we were at one point trying to make it sound more academic-y, but then we realized there's plenty of people who do things that aren't academic-y that try to make them sound academic-y. And so that's where we came up with spooky evenings, because I always tell people to have a spooky evening at the end. But yeah, so we've had that debate. A lot of people are just like, I don't like horror. And it's like, well, we have a lot of different things on it. It's not just,
Yeah.
Because I find a lot of people, their mind goes to like gory.
Yeah, sure.
More than it goes to violence, which if you think about in terms of horror, most horror actually isn't violent.
No, well, for me, it's the best horror is the horror that's in the characters' heads and hearts, and it's mood and atmosphere more than anything else. If you I was recently rereading The Shining, and that's a terrifying book, but it's not a particularly gory or gross book in any way. Like there's not a lot of violence in The Shining other than commonplace violence, everyday violence. You get sort of domestic violence and things like that. And so like real horror, I think people have this sort of like surface level idea about horror is it's gore, like you said, but then when they really get down into it, if you really asked them about it, they would say they don't like horror because horror may be just too close to what they know in the world in
Sure.
everyday life. So that to me is like, that's where you want to be as a writer, is finding that audience that appreciates that and responds to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, also you have to wonder too, just the sort of icons, if you will, of contemporary horror. I suppose starting with like Mike Myers have shifted the perception of horror because those franchises have been pushed so hard.
Mm-hmm. Well, and he exists in that tradition of slashers, right?
So, right, and I'm wondering if that's not polluted the water a bit.
Could be. I think slashers are. I think it's kind of funny because film drives horror much more than the literary world ever like drives it these days. Like there was a time in the 80s when film kind of, I would say, almost took a back seat to horror, to literary horror, because you've got, and I say literary in the sense of just books being published versus movies being made. In the 80s, you've got people like King and Kuntz, and you've got Clive Barker, and you've got this whole range of horror that's being delivered to people through books. And so there's something different about the experience of a book and a movie, and movies. Horror in movies is a really popular genre. I think it's a way that, cynically, from the point of view of like filmmakers, it's a way to break into film and make money with a relatively low budget, is my understanding of it. But
absolutely.
but audiences, I guess the gore is part of the visual medium too. Like most horror films do have that kind of violence inherent because it's pictures and it's images. And
well, I mean, the ones that try to go mainstream do, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we got like, what is it? Halloween Kills is the new one coming out, right? This is without even sort of knowing anything about it before anything came out. I mean, the new trailer came out, which is super gory. I knew it was going to be a gory movie, right? Mm-hmm. I contrast that though to like stuff coming out, say like A24. Mm-hmm. And I know that's not going to be as gory by and large. And obviously the body count will never be as high as like a Halloween movie. So I think there are dual markets competing
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's like mass market horror and then probably like a highbrow horror being created filmically, at least.
Well, and even like you can make the argument that the Halloween films that are being made now are, and Carpenter's original film certainly, that those are kind of a high art compared to some of the sequels that were made, and
Oh, absolutely.
when you're cashing in on those things, right? So yeah, I think people are easily I don't know, I don't want to say tricked, but I think movies have a way of bringing people in, and people have preconceived notions about movies, I've found. And so they'll go to see a horror film and they may not even realize that they've not only seen a good horror film, but they've just seen a really good film. Like like we just rewatched with a friend of ours who had not seen it, Ginger Snaps.
Okay.
Do you know that one?
Yeah, the female werewolf movie.
Yeah, and that is a beautiful movie in and of itself. It's like, apart from the fact that it's a stellar example of a werewolf film, which is kind of a hard thing to come by,
Yeah.
you know, but it's just a beautiful movie too. And so I think most people might come away from that not realizing maybe they've just seen a great film in addition to a really good horror movie. Um, and that might be the case with the Halloween movies. I don't know, but I think directors and filmmakers now are finding their way into like both camps of the audience, the people who really appreciate film and are thinking about it in terms of what's going on from the director's point of view or the writer's point of view, or fans of that genre of film. And then there's just people who want to go be scared. So
yeah.
yeah.
I rewatched The Wicker Man recently, the original, and it's just a good movie.
It is. It's a scary movie.
Yeah, because this could happen.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really think that genre snobbery is a real thing that I think writers fight against, and writers in the horror genre really have their fair share of it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame too, because in terms of horror, there are the most variety of choices of paths that you can go down, and that's what I don't understand why people don't seem to get that. Like your stuff, as I say, borrows a lot from these different, almost like folkloric traditions that then you migrate to the United States. But they're old stories, some of them, the ones that you bring in, even if it's a smaller character. And I'm talking about both your books, the In the Valley of the Sun and Boatman's Daughter in this case. And so you seem to have that affinity for the genre itself. But it's revealing, because it lets you know that there are a multiplicity of ways to get into the genre. Because it's also, I use the term Southern Gothic, which I think is fitting for a number of reasons too, because at its heart, Southern Gothic, if you think about the primary authors of Southern Gothic, like Faulkner, right? It comes down to these core relationship things with families and responsibilities and the onuses one puts on oneself.
Yeah, which is a big part of the third book that I just finished, that I'm hoping comes out next year. That deals specifically with like land and things like that, inherited land, and so
Really Southern.
It is really Southern in a lot of ways, but I kept thinking as I was writing it, these people are all Yankees, like it's kind of the Southerner who is not really a Southerner, like the family, because there's a lot of that.
Carpetbagger.
Right, the carpetbagger. There's a lot of that here in Georgia. There's a whole county up from us where the entire county was basically bought up by like a northern lumber baron who came down and paid just pennies on the dollar for land after the Civil War, and the result of that was basically 40 years of people killing each other and murdering people over that. So it's fascinating. But in back to the thing about like multiple ways in, that to me says, well, this is maybe a crime story. This is a horror story. I think about my first book. It's like, well, this is a Western. This is a noir. This is a slasher. This is a vampire story. And
Mhm.
so to me, that's the great intersection of those things. Is for me as a writer, that's what's really appealing, is being able to marry those multiple types of genre elements together into a story that not only would appeal to a broader audience maybe, but just really appeals to me in terms of a story. Like if I were going to go to the movies and see a film, I'd want to see one that touched on all those things. um,
It's interesting because when I was getting ready to for this interview, right, I was reading your stuff and Christopher Triana's stuff at the same time.
mhm.
And like the world started to melt together in my mind. And then I'd already interviewed Grady Hendrix, and so I had all this other Southern stuff from him too in there. And I'm reading Veronica Henry's Bacchanal
Mhm.
to interview her, and I'm just like, wow, because they all could exist, and they do all exist in the South in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it was just, I had to take a moment and like pause and resort myself to remember which person was casting which spell where, in which area of the country. And at the same time, I was in Savannah, so I was having the entire experience of being in Savannah as sort of
Yeah.
like the bowl holding all of this.
Mhm. Yeah, Savannah's a fun place. It's interesting. My wife, her family, they're Irish, her on her father's side, and so they're all from Savannah. And we've kind of been there over the years, in and out with family. And I'm not from Georgia.
Mm.
I grew up in Arkansas, so I am Southern, and I don't feel Southern most days. I think most academics who come through a program or what have you, who like study Southernness, whatever, um, most of us end up feeling like Quentin Compson. And it's the thing about, I don't hate the South. I don't hate the South. You love the South, but you're very conflicted by the South as
Mhm.
well. And so, yeah, for me, that's kind of, yeah, Savannah is one of those places that it's like, it's a city that's kind of like New Orleans, in that it
Yep.
has such an amazing cosmopolitan nature, but at its core, there is a fundamentally Southern quality to
Oh
Savannah.
yeah.
Its own characteristic. Yeah.
But I mean, it casts back to it constantly too, which is interesting. I'm really surprised more. I mean, I guess I was talking to Juan earlier, my producer, about Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil,
Mhm.
and I don't know if it just put such a hard anchor down. I mean, obviously it's a true story, but I don't know if it puts such a hard anchor down in Savannah that it kind of like makes it off limits as a setting now, or what. I'm just surprised more hasn't been set there.
Yeah. Um, yeah, well, and Savannah really embraces that too. They love the idea that Savannah is what he wrote about in that
Yeah.
book. Um, and I guess that's again talking about how to sell something, talking about genre. Savannah has done a very good job of creating the mythos that's in that book, which was a reflection of the actual place,
Yeah.
but ballooning that into a kind of tourist destination for uh, that place that's in the book. So they feed each other. And
Yeah, it does have like an Epcot at Disney feel to it now.
right.
I mean, no offense to Savannah, but it has that quality to it because there's a falseness to it now as it tries to become sort of like a simulacra through the both the Clint Eastwood film and the original source book, and as you say, and then the real sort of like media spectacle around the trial itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Performing oneself.
mhm. Yeah, I really like the city. We go there at least once a year, maybe a couple of times. During the lockdown, one of the things that we did, my wife and I did, to get out of the house, we drove to Savannah and walked around for several hours in the cemetery
Mm.
in Bonaventure, and just kind of, that was a way to get out and be in the world and not be, in the world. And it's kind of a weird thing, like talking about horror writers and being weirdos. We don't hang out in cemeteries, right? But I do always like to go to cemeteries, and one of the things I tend to do is write down names. And just like you can find the best names in cemeteries if you're ever stuck for character names. So
That's what Dickens used to do.
was it? I didn't know that. Wow. So
Yeah.
there you go.
So
Yeah.
Ebenezer Scrooge came from Edward Scroggie.
Wow. That's great.
So that's where that one came from. All right. So in terms of the two books you got here, you got as I said, In the Valley of the Sun, which by the way, we spoil everything here. So you've been warned. Yeah, we had an earlier author on, and it was like the book had just come out the day we were talking to them. It's like, and now we are going to tell you everything that happens in the book, page by page, almost. This, as you said, this is an interesting because it's obviously a very Western theme. Which it's interesting to me because that's becoming more and more popular in the genre of horror, to see the horror Western come out. And, I'm noting the swamp thing here. So I guess the other thing to ask you too is, do you feel like you fit into like a nerddom with your writing? And if so, my follow-up as a footnote to that question is, were you a fan of Preacher?
Yes, the answer to that part is yes. I'm a big fan of Preacher. But nerddom, I don't know. I mean, like if you separate me from my books, just like I don't know. It's that's a good question. No one's ever asked that question. So, and I've thought about it a lot, but I never want to talk about it like to anybody without someone else bringing it up, because it feels like you could slip and say something really pretentious that you don't want to say. Well, I mean, okay, all right. So there's a lot of the conversation around that first book. There were comparisons to Cormac McCarthy, or there were comparisons to William Gay. And I only mention that because that kind of sets up an expectation for what a writer is, right? Some of my favorite writers right now who are working in the sort of Gothic, Southern adjacent or Southern genres are people like Donald Ray Pollock, or I just discovered Michael Ferris Smith. I had to look to make sure I got his name right. Who had a book come out right at the same time that Boatman's Daughter came out. And so I kept seeing it in bookstores, but I never got around to grabbing it, called Blackwood. So there, with the Southern male, white male writer, I guess, there comes like a notion of what that is.
Sure.
And so I think all through my life, even before I was a writer, one of the things people always said to me, and someone actually said it in one of my events when I was promoting Boatman's Daughter, "You're from Arkansas, you don't really have an accent." And it's like, well,
you just did on accent.
Oh, okay. See, right. Like, yeah, it's there, but it's not there. And so, I guess with the nerddom thing, it's like my wife and I are huge nerds. I mean, we are Star Wars people. We are Doctor Who people. We are comic book people. I can't think of anything in nerddom that we actually don't like at some point in our week as we go through the week. So yeah, I mean, but then when you get into the idea of who are you as a writer, what's your persona, I think the first two books that I've written go deeper than that, because that aspect of who I am has only come into being really to the forefront as a visible part of me, I think in the last maybe 10 years or so, or since we've been married. Because I think, there was a time when certain things just weren't cool. It was not cool to like Star Wars in the late 90s and early 2000s for reasons that were very, how do you put it? valid.
Because George Lucas took the films and did horrible things to them. Is that
Right,
the
right.
reason?
There were painful things happening in that world, right? And so even those of us who deep in our hearts did love it, in spite of those things, we kind of put our toys away. You know, it's like you thought, okay, well, that's, I can't love that openly anymore because it's been destroyed. So, and I've also found as a coda to that, as you get older, you look back on things and you think, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought it was. Or, you know what, maybe there's some affection in my heart for Jar Jar Binks that I didn't have when I was in my early 20s. You know, so it's kind of weird how those things happen, but as you get older, but no, I mean, there was a period in my life where that seemed like a separate aspect of me, you know. And so as I've gotten older, it's kind of come back and it's sort of been affirmed as part of who I am, this love of pop culture and things that really are all way deep down inside that are the stew of whatever I'm writing and working on. So in a book like In the Valley of the Sun, there's a lot of influence from something like, say, Near Dark, Catherine Bigelow's film, or in The Boatman's Daughter, there's Swamp Thing, or there's Conan comic books kind of referenced on the sly in there too. So there's a lot of childhood stuff that keeps creeping back in, and so I think with the third book that I've just written and just yesterday or the day before got.
Yeah, I saw your post that you felt sick.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of like you wake up and you're sore and you wonder, why am I sore? It's because I've been sitting in one position for a month, for 8 hours a day, sometimes 12 hours a day, trying to get this finished. But there's a lot in that book that was very conscious. Like it was my effort to be conscious about childhood influences and things that I still carry around in my heart, as these are the things that really make me who I am. So I'm trying to bring those things closer and closer together, I guess, is a long way to answer your question. So, but yes, I'm also a fan of Preacher. I
definitely got that.
Yeah, I discovered Preacher when I was in graduate school, in that time when, you know, the things of childhood had kind of fallen away, and so you sort of turn to more cynical, darker incarnations of the things you loved, which in this case would have been comic books. And Preacher was definitely Preacher was dark.
Yeah, a little bit,
but wonderful too. Yeah, and we were fans of the series adaptation on AMC that Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg did. So yeah, I like Preacher quite a bit.
The adaptation had its moments. It's one of those things, though, I feel like, because I read that in high school, I guess, when it came out, and it's one of those things that is just like already so ingrained into like how I understood it to be, that it just
it took a while for us to kind of find the rhythm with it.
Yeah,
and it definitely had its highs and lows, and there were things that it did that were different, that were very different, or interpretations of characters that were different, sometimes for good, sometimes for not. So, but yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of a mixed bag, but
it's interesting. So with your first book, you know,
speaking of mixed bags,
you're not a fan of your own first book?
No. I'm thinking, like, again, in terms of like all the different things that go into a book, like thinking like that first book was like Tender Mercies. There was a bit of Taxi Driver in that first book. There was Near Dark in that first book, and then of course there's like every Stephen King book you've ever read, but also there's No Country for Old Men that I kept reading and rereading while I was writing that book. So mixed bag only in the sense of like, if you reach in, you could grab a different thing every time. Yeah.
See, I keep thinking, but again, I don't know if it's just coincidental because I was reading both of you guys' stuff at the same time or what, but both of them, I was like, God, Night of the Hunter, just over and over again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just kept popping into my brain.
Yeah, there's not a lot of stuff I write that doesn't go back to Night of the Hunter. In fact, if I could pull epigraphs for every book from Night of the Hunter, I'd be happy. But I figure that's going to get old eventually. But I talk about that book all the time. Any chance I get when someone brings it up or I'm in front of people in public, because most people remember the film,
Mm.
which, you know, is amazing. But most people don't know the book, and the book is just beautiful. It's this it's essentially the film. It's a lyrical, gorgeously written book that deals quite wonderfully with the perspectives of these children being pursued by this monster. And yeah, it's just really good. I mean, I can't think of like, I don't think there's much that's different about the book from the film. So it's one of those perfect translations of a book to film.
It's interesting. I mean, because both of these books, Boatman's Daughter and In the Valley of the Sun, both are these fairy tale kind of constructs too, which is another reason I asked earlier about the idea of dark fantasy. Because you do have, I mean, I don't think I'm giving much away to say you have vampires. I feel like the title might give a little bit away. Was that intentional or?
No, the title came pretty late in the process.
Okay.
If you want a title that would give a lot away, my original title for the book was Honky Tonk Vampire.
Okay. Yeah, Honky Tonk Vampire definitely would have.
Which ran counter to what I ultimately ended up doing, which was not even having the word vampire be in the book. In part, that was a conscious decision because vampires at the time that I wrote the book were not terribly popular in terms of adult mainstream readers. A lot of vampirism was in the YA genre at that time, and I think Twilight had a lot to do with kind of besmirching the notion of a vampire being scary. And so I just sort of wanted it to be there but not be named, and see if people responded to that.
Well, then the cover art kind of
right, which that was its own fun journey too. I think the cover late in the revision process of the manuscript, and I'm thinking now this is like 2015, 2016 maybe, I added a character detail about Annabelle, the young woman who runs the motel in the book. And the character detail was that she, in her motel cafe, had pictures that she had taken from various angles around the property of sunsets. And I thought, well, because I think it was called the Sundowner Inn. But I added that late in the process. And when it came time to talk about the cover, some of the initial cover concepts just didn't quite grab me. They weren't bad, but they weren't saying what the book was. And I, like, in terms of the characters, and I thought the cover needed to really like send a sense of convey a sense of dread. And I thought about Annabelle and those pictures that she took, and so I said, well, what about if it's a picture of a sunset, but you know, you can layer in some of those sort of filters of scratches and photo grain and make it look old, like it was found in the bottom of a drawer somewhere. But it's just full of menace, and that was an idea that they ran with and ended up with something pretty cool, I thought. Although later, when the paperback came out, the publisher said, which was 2 years, I think, after the initial release, the publisher said, we want this to say horror. You know, this cover says literary, it says Western, it says this or that. We want it to firmly be horror. And so I went back to the drawing board again.
You went back to Honky Tonk Vampire.
Well, no. Yeah, I mean, in a way, I guess so. Cowboy vampire, really.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we found, I kind of came up with this image in my head of like the skull with the teeth and the cowboy hat. And I sent them this mock-up that I cobbled together in Photoshop from other people's novels. It was really terrible, but they came up with something kind of cool. And it was my idea, actually, at the end, to put the cover from the first book like in one of the eye sockets of the skull that's on the cover of the paperback. So the hardback's sunset image is in the eye of the skull, which is kind of cool too. So Because I think one of the things I would say it was fun about all of this is I've been fortunate so far with 2 books to have fantastic covers, and in every iteration, really. Um, and I'm dreading that day when I don't. But part of the reason I think they've been good is that they've asked a lot of questions
Okay.
and gotten input from me, and so that's always fun. That's a fun
We've
part
talked
of
a
the
lot about book
process.
covers this
We
summer. It's
have,
been
yeah.
kind of crazy.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? With marketing is how do you sell a book without turning a reader off? How do you convey what a book's about without
Yeah.
um and then, the cover for Boatman's Daughter, which has the what we came to affectionately call Treehead Man, that uh was kind of a controversial idea too. um because it's called The Boatman's Daughter, but it's about Miranda, but the boatman is on the cover. There were a couple of conversations about that. Is that the right thing for that? And plus, it's just kind of just, it's such a weird image, but at the same time, I think it's a really striking image. Like almost inevitably, when I went to bookstores and I saw it on shelves, it would be faced out, it would be turned so that people could see the cover. And I thought, well, that was a good thing. Had much less input, or at least like I gave much less direction on that cover. That was I forget the artist. I think it was Sarah Wood who did it. She has a she does a lot of covers for FSG, and that was just a beautiful thing. I'd kind of said some of my influences when I was thinking about imagery were old EC Comics, Graham Ingalls, some of those guys who did those really great, heavily inked horror comics from the 1940s, 1930s. And so I think they pulled it off with that one. That was a really cool image.
Yeah, I mean it's pretty striking. I think these are all becoming more sophisticated in general, though. I mean, there's a lot of horror books coming out, and I feel like the covers are becoming a lot more sophisticated, even than say somebody like Kuntz or Stephen King. I think you're getting much more thoughtful
Yeah.
art
And
production.
of course, all of us who are writing horror are just praying and hoping that the bottom doesn't fall out of the market, as it sometimes does when things get saturated. But
I don't know. People seem pretty eager for more and more. I don't know if it's just because I'm paying attention to the online community more and more, or
mm-hmm. Well, again, with Tor, their new imprint, Nightfire, that's a big deal in the publishing world to have a kind of storied publisher like Tor, who's owned by Macmillan, um, go all in with this subgenre of what they do, which is primarily fantasy and science fiction, and they've done dark fantasy and things like that, but they're throwing in and they're going to have an entirely horror-based label. So it's really exciting.
um, so in the Valley of the Sun, it comes out. You're nominated for a Stoker Award for best first novel. Um, and were you surprised by the reception? Were you happy? I mean, obviously you had to be happy with the reception, but were you surprised by it, or were you just like, yes, it should have been more? I mean,
No, I never thought it should have been more. Yeah, I guess I was. You know, I had kind of, I had made, my wife and I had sort of made some inroads into the horror writing community in preparation for the book coming out, just knowing that one of the things as a writer you have to do now is come up with a platform, be on social media, be present. And part of that is networking and knowing other people. And so, like, if you look at the back of that hardcover version of In the Valley of the Sun, you'll see a lot of blurbs. Not all of those people are horror writers. A
right.
lot of those are writers that I just knew who were kind enough to say, yeah, I'll read it and say something about it if it's good. And so I didn't know a lot of people in that community at the time who were horror writers. in fact, I'm thinking about, of all the people, I mean, the one that we were most excited by was Stephen Graham Jones. He blurred the book, and I didn't know him at all. I'd never met him. Have since met him. I met him at a convention at StokerCon in 2016, I think. And he's a wonderful person. Just
Yeah, he's coming on in October, actually.
that's such a treat. He's cool. He's like the coolest dude ever. So, but yeah, I didn't know a lot of horror writers, and so I remember we were sitting at the banquet for those awards, the Stokers, in 2016. My wife and I, and we were sitting with a friend of ours, Lisa Kroger, who, I don't know if you've seen her book, but Lisa and Melanie Anderson have a book, Monster She Wrote, which is from Quirk, which is kind of like this nice companion to Paperbacks from Hell that Grady Hendrix wrote. And it's a wonderful book about the women who wrote horror, dating all the way back, to the early establishment of the genre. And it is a beautiful book. But Lisa was there with us, and I remember just sort of talking to her and saying, nice to be here next year. But that was it. Like that was the most that you entertained that notion that maybe like it would be received well and might even, and I think a lot of the accolades that it got, and it got as far as it did, were owed to librarians and people who are not traditionally buying books at a Barnes and Noble or buying books in even an independent bookstore. These are people who are acquiring books for people to read for free. Becky Spratford is a horror advocate. She's with the American Library Association, and she loved the book. And so, yeah, I guess I was kind of delighted by the way it was received. And genuinely sort of surprised that a first book got that much attention. And I, it's not like it got a lot of attention compared to, some first books, but it got enough to be remembered.
Which ones are you thinking there?
Well, I mean, like I'll give you an example.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
There's another writer by the name of Andrew Davidson, actually, which is my name. He's a Canadian guy, and by circumstance, I happen to know a person who was with my agent, knows him, and so I think we're both aware that each of us is in the world. But he was the guy that wrote Gargoyle many years ago, and I think got like $1 million advance for it. It was one of those advances that kind of broke the system. Like the book did not do well financially, and so like I'm sure he's one of those people that publishers point to and say, we're not doing that anymore because of this guy. So, but I will say that, like there's different ways, right? A book is successful different ways. Getting $1 million advance is not necessarily saying your book is successul. It's just saying
it makes you successful.
It makes you successful, so you don't have to, teach or whatever. You can write your books full time. But yeah, no, I mean, I was very delighted by the reception that it got. And then 2 years later, the part that really delighted me was long after all the talk of, the nominations and whatnot. Sadie Hartman, Mother Horror on Twitter, who is kind of this pioneer of bookstagramming and whatnot, promoting books on Instagram, saw it and liked it and reviewed it, and that gave it this new life when it came out in paperback 2 years after it had been in hardback, and it kept going. And so to this day, it's been a consistently selling book. Like I haven't seen sales for it fall off necessarily. Ebbs and flows, but generally it is still selling copies, and that's in part due to just finding its way into the right people's hands. So it's a lot of fortune. It's just a lot of good fortune.
One of these things I've been following recently in terms of also just online presences for authors is there's a big controversy with Goodreads a couple weeks ago.
What's the latest one? I don't know.
Well, they deleted a lot of reviews, and
Oh yeah, yeah, they do that from time to time. They flush out the system of I've known it to be people who, like, you compare reviews on Goodreads to Amazon, or if people on Goodreads are reviewing your book who are your friends on Twitter, things like that. So I know they do kind of. I know Amazon. I think it was Amazon did the culling. I wasn't really.
well, Amazon owns them, right?
Oh, do they?
I
I don't even
believe
know.
so.
Yeah,
I think that's the case.
that makes sense. Yeah, Goodreads. Goodreads is the bane and the blessing of every author these days, for one reason or another.
I just saw a lot of horror authors on Twitter losing it over basically the purge.
Well, I try to not pay attention to that as much as possible. So, I mean, I could have had things purged. I don't know. Um, because I found early on that there's a weed eater going out here now.
Can't hear it.
Good. I found early on that paying too much attention to your reviews, user reviews, especially like just your average person who picked up the book and read it, it gets in your head in a very bad way. And I've never been the kind of person who wanted to engage with anybody. No, God, no. If I got a bad review, I'm never going to respond to that. Which is advice Jonathan Mayberry has given at many of his talks. Don't ever respond if you're a writer and you get a bad review. But no, I try not to pay attention to it, because I think if you get too caught up in checking your Goodreads reviews or whatever, you start seeing that number creep down. The more reviews you get, which is a good thing, you start seeing that number creep down from 5 stars to 4 stars to 3.5 stars until it finally settles somewhere around 3.5, and that's just uncomfortable, you know. So you don't want to think, is it mediocre? I don't know. So, and then there are readers who read books and don't get what you were trying to do, and Goodreads is a platform for them to post that publicly and, you know, affect the market.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a weird, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the hyper globalization of opinions.
Yeah, that hasn't led to any trouble lately, has it?
Yeah, I mean, it's deleted the truth as a thing, you know. It's
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I don't know.
because I mean, objectively, I think we can say it doesn't really, you don't have to be political about it. Opinion has replaced truth.
Oh yeah. No, I totally agree with that 100%. I'm just thinking specifically about Goodreads. I think.
Well, I mean, it's a symptom of the same thing. It doesn't.
It is. I think my wife and I have a game we play. It's called Internet Good, Internet Bad.
Okay.
And basically, it's just a game where you say, okay, here's a thing that cropped up in the news this week. All right, this horrible atrocity happened because the internet exists. Okay. If this did not exist, this would not be the case, because people would not have a platform to say stupid, horrible things, and that information would not be pushed out to the rest of the world. So on the one hand, the internet has united people around their insanity, conspiracy theories, QAnon stuff, all this craziness in the world. The internet has made that possible to get a foothold and actually, like, build a cult following around it when people are decentralized from that, you know, from the source of that. People aren't moving, QAnon people aren't moving to a camp somewhere in Utah, you know, out in the mountains, and they're not like using guns.
Sounds like a book there.
Well, I was going to say, at least not all of them. Some of them may be, but like, on the other hand, the internet's given us communities of people who come together and affect real change in a positive way, you know, like I'm just thinking about Twitter. You know, people talk about social media being a toilet or it's a cesspool, and it's kind of like, well, it depends on what you cultivate. I think it's like anything in life. If you pay attention to things that are good and positive, then your feed tends to be that, minus a few things that creep in because the world just creeps in. But yeah, I mean, there's communities of like fandom. There's communities of readers. There's communities of writers who have come together and have the ability to talk to one another now in a way that they didn't. So there's movements like Me Too, these things that crop up, that Black Lives Matter, all of these things are like they coalesce around social media. And so it's internet good, internet bad. So that's the game we play sometimes.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So, speaking of things that were popular by you, The Boatman's Daughter, pretty popular book, sir.
Well, I think so. It's kind of weird. Like you don't always have that perspective when you're week to week, like looking at the number of copies that sell or whatever. But you do eventually come to an idea that like maybe people like this book mostly.
I mean, I could still walk into a Barnes and Noble and it would be on the shelf.
Well, that's wonderful.
In fact, we did. We went just to see, basically, when we had programmed this summer. We were like, what's on the shelf at our local Barnes and Nobles, because there's two here in Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And almost every book was on at least one of them. Mm. Obviously, like Stephen King was half of them.
Well, that's just a nice little bonus of horror coming back into vogue, as Barnes and Noble now is starting to have horror sections again that aren't just Stephen King and Dean Koontz and Joe Hill. There's a few other people in there now, and that's really good. I think that our local Barnes and Noble up in Macon is cultivating a really good horror section.
Do you go up there, sneak in and sign them every once in a while?
I don't do that because I'm happy that anytime my book has kind of wandered onto the shelf, it kind of goes away quickly. So I guess someone there who knows me probably is buying a copy of my book when they see it on the shelf. But that section was cultivated by one of my former students in one of my creative writing classes who worked there. So I'm very proud of that. It's like I did the right thing.
I saw Stephen Graham Jones had done that recently. He went into a Barnes and Noble and signed the top copy out.
I did that for the first time. So this kind of answers your question. I did that for the first time in Myrtle Beach in the Barnes and Noble at Myrtle Beach. My wife, my in-laws, her family, her mother and father lived in South Carolina. And so we had to go down there earlier in the summer, and we had kind of taken a break for a minute and went into the bookstore. And I've been in this Barnes and Noble many times since my book came out, and it's never been on the shelf. And I don't think that's because it was selling out. I think it's because they never ordered it. But lo and behold, there it was. And I was so thrilled that, like, after a pandemic and almost a year and a half later, this book is on the shelf. And that is the only one to date that I have ever taken off the shelf and signed surreptitiously. And I put the date on it when I signed it. So somebody out there, if they bought it, has that copy, hopefully. But the thing I noticed about it, and I checked this, was that it was in I want to say it was a second, maybe third printing. Second printing, I think, at least. So that kind of answers your question. It's like, yes, I think it was successful to a degree that I had not thought it would be, because when I was writing it, I thought it was just a weird book.
Like, it is a weird book.
Right. It is a weird book. And I was writing it for myself. And I think that's part of why, if people like it, I liked it, like, as I was writing it. That's not always the truth about a book, unfortunately, is that when you get deep in the weeds with a book, sometimes you really start to hate
deep in the swamp.
Yeah. Or in the woods, literally in the woods, and is in the case with this third book. Sometimes you really start to hate it. You get really frustrated by it because it doesn't do what you want it to do, or you can't make the story iron out, and it's just eating up your life. But this book, Boatman's Daughter, I really never felt that way about it. I just loved it. And so yeah, I found out from my publisher about a month or two ago that it had done better than they expected it to do. Which was not that they put it that way, but just that it performed beyond its expectations. So yeah, I think it's done well. Yeah.
I'm just imagining this very dry assessment of oneself coming back. You were better than we thought you'd be.
No,
Keep it up.
Yeah, in fairness to them, it was not put to me that way. That's probably my filter, because I have a way of getting good news and then completely and totally running it through the but what's wrong filter. And
Yeah.
so yeah, and I can find something good out and immediately find the bad in it.
So you said you wrote this one for yourself, and I mean that's interesting too, because Arkansas is obviously its own character in a way in Boatman's Daughter. And I never, I've been to Little Rock, I suppose. I never I've driven through Arkansas, but I know that's what people say to you.
It's the line in Forrest Gump. It's my favorite line in the movie Forrest Gump when they meet Lieutenant Dan in Vietnam. He's like, so you boys are from Arkansas, huh? Of course, they're from Alabama. It's like, I've been through Little Rock. Little Rock's a fine town. That's my favorite line. Little Rock's a fine town. It's just so, it sums up Arkansas so well to someone.
Well, topographically, I don't think of Arkansas the way it appears in the book. And I mean, obviously, I have no sort of like point of reference for that. Right. But I imagine I'm not the only person out there in the world who just has no idea of the topography of Arkansas.
Yeah, Arkansas is a wonderful state topographically in terms of
just topographically.
Well, there's a lot to commend Arkansas. Its people are by and large very good people. I don't know about its government. I think Arkansas's government does better than other states around it, like Mississippi, in terms of like being certainly not progressive, but they have a better history of electing governors who are just a little bit smarter than the people that Mississippi elects, So, although we do have the Huckabees from Arkansas too, which actually, I went to school. Okay, I found out something I don't want to talk about. I went to school with Mike Huckabee's one of his sons. So I probably shouldn't say any more about that.
We were a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Kate Reed Petty, and we discovered we were in class together in college.
Oh, wow.
And didn't know it.
That's cool. Well, Arkansas. So topographically, Arkansas is a fascinating, interesting state. It's got delta plains, it's got mountains, it's got rivers and streams, it's got sort of lowlands and wetlands, so in pine lands and river bottoms. So yeah, I think there's a lot. They call it the natural state, I guess, for a reason. So there's a lot to commend Arkansas in terms of its appeal geographically or naturally, I guess, to hunters or sportsmen or whatever. But for me, the reason that I set the Boatman's Daughter down in that corner of the state was more or less that corner of the state had its own little mythology that I knew about from childhood because I lived about an hour away from it. And that was the Fouke monster and sort of that down around Fouke, Arkansas. There was that film that was made in the 60s by Charles Pierce, The Legend of Boggy Creek, which is a big influence on the book as well. So that's kind of the pseudo documentary about the monster that kind of dwells down there in the river bottom. And so it's kind of like a drive-in horror movie, but it's done in the style of a documentary. And so as a kid, I saw that film and it terrified me because it seemed real. Obviously, I knew that things were being reenacted in some of the things that I saw because the monster looks terrible. And when you get up close to him, he's kind of goofy. But I thought that the film later, when I came back to it, held up really well And one of the things it got right about Arkansas was a sense of place. And that was one of the things I really wanted to do, was get a sense of place right. Because I think as you get older, and you go back home, home gets very complicated. Home is many different things. It's not just home anymore. But Arkansas has always felt, anytime I cross the Mississippi, uh, and I see that I'm heading into Arkansas, it's always felt like I'm home. For better or worse, this is home. So I wanted to try to capture that in the book. And I think one of the things I've been doing from book to book is jumping around the South. So the first book's set in Texas, this one was set in Arkansas, and then my next book will be set in Georgia. So, I guess Mississippi and Alabama.
See, that's the most controversial thing you've said today. You've called Texas the South.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Is it the West? Is it the South? East Texas certainly feels like the South. But I said it in West Texas, so it's kind of a Western too. Yeah, you're right.
See, well, I'm from Virginia, so I have the same sort of Southern anxieties.
So you're on the far other end of what is the South. Yeah.
Well, we're the, yeah.
I found something you don't want to talk about.
Well, it's funny because when Grady was on, I decided to wear a seersucker suit because in my mind I was convinced he would too. And then he came on and he was sort of like appalled that he was underdressed. And then I noticed the next interview he did, he was in a seersucker suit. And I told Juan, I said, I think we triggered Grady Hendrick.
That's funny. I've seen him in a seersucker suit, actually.
Yeah.
I've seen him in that. So it's
yeah.
Not out of the realm of possibility to expect
that. Or like the guy, the vampire in his book, I was expecting the phrase is ice cream suit is I just it was locked in my brain the whole time that this is what this guy was going to be in. So I was like, I have to be prepared. In terms of the book too, it's interesting. I've noticed, and you do this quite a bit, particularly in Boatman's Daughter. But I've noticed in other authors, gender gets really interesting because I've noticed a lot of male authors tend to write, even from the point of omniscience, in a female voice, and a lot of women authors are writing from a male voice, at least for a part of the books anymore. And maybe that's just a coincidence of the books I've picked to do the series in. But I have noticed that as a commonality, and it's something I'm just in general intrigued by in the realm of horror anyway, because I'm intrigued by this idea of particularly filmically, we see the female gaze emerging in horror and being sort of like more primary in the genre. And so I'm curious about those decisions.
Well, I think it is that it's the effort to try and subvert what has traditionally been a male gaze in horror. Like going back to people again, like I don't want to pick on Stephen King, but I think we can pick on Stephen King because he's Stephen
I think
King.
He'll be fine.
He'll be okay. If you read The Shining, which I think is one of his best written books, King will passionately defend Wendy Torrance as a heroine that he loves, so much so that I think a lot of what surrounds his negativity about Kubrick's film adaptation is that Shelley Duvall was cast in that role. Because later you see in the film, in the TV version that came out, it was Rebecca De Mornay, and so it's much more in line with what King wrote about, which is this sort of long-legged blonde. I wouldn't say sex pot, but Wendy is definitely sexier in the book than she is in Kubrick's film. And that's a problem for me, like as a reader and as a male reader. I think King sometimes, like, just to kind of use him as an example, I think in horror, you sometimes find this fixation upon description of women in terms of their sexuality, in terms of their physicality. And that's certainly the case with Wendy in The Shining in the book. Although she's a great character too, it's not like those two things don't exist simultaneously. But I remember Grady talking about him. I was on a panel with him when my first book came out, a library panel, and he said that horror was a woman's genre, which is interesting as a perspective. I think it certainly is kind of trending that way in terms of heroines, in terms of that what you said, the female gaze, this idea of um, the female perspective versus the male perspective. And I think too often the perspective has been the male. Too often it's been this kind of really like sort of icky, uncomfortable way of looking at women from a male writer's perspective, and certainly white males. So I think in a way it's just a sort of, it doesn't interest me to write from a male perspective, for those reasons in some ways. I think if you look at if you like for your heroes to be the outsiders, or you like for your heroes to be the put upon people, or the people who are the underdogs, I think traditionally women and children in horror fit that bill pretty well, because they tend to fall into the roles of victims most often in horror. And so to take that and subvert that and make them strong and make them powerful is a really appealing idea, I think, in the modern world for a lot of writers. So that's just from my perspective. I don't know. I can't speak for other male writers, but.
Well, it's interesting to me because if you go back to like the 19th century, let's say, and you look at something like, say, Frankenstein, right? You have a female author writing from the male perspective. And then if you go to Bram Stoker and Dracula, right, you have quite a lot written from the female perspective. And Mina Harker in particular is praised for, I mean, Van Helsing at one point says she has a man's brain.
Mm-hmm.
And she's always sort of like constructed as this modernist woman. So in a literary point of view, it has been there.
Mm-hmm.
It gets lost, because horror goes through a lot of different transitions. If we push it into the 20th century, transitioning through like Lovecraft and things.
Oh yeah.
Which becomes very distinctly masculine.
Yeah.
In its construct. And then, the people who come out as sort of like the secondary wave of people like Robert Bloch coming out as a good legacy from the Lovecraft tradition. And then you get, Psycho and things like that, which are these distortions of the male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
And you really don't see change from there in the 20th century. I mean, the closest I think you get is occasionally in Clive Barker in the 80s, and then perhaps some arguments can be made for Anne Rice.
Mm-hmm.
But that's it in the 20th century. So the 21st century now is really fighting back on that and playing with his roles, particularly in a literary sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think that's only going to continue. I would not be surprised if I say this kind of not having read a lot of what's currently out there. So, but I would not be surprised if the narratives tend to be more female centric as we kind of go forward in the genre, both from a male and a female perspective. Just because I think right now, I mean, one of the things I just did was I've been asked to be a guest editor for Southwest Review for their horror issue that comes out in October. And I had an open call for submissions to the horror community, and I got a lot of stories and a lot of poetry. And one of the prevailing things that I found in the submissions, that the stuff that was sent to me, was an overriding emphasis and focus on women in a domestic space, kind of in sort of the vein of Shirley Jackson a little bit, but also just like confined, not just men writing those things, but women writing those things, confined or trying to break free from something, traditional roles or in some way, shape, or form. And that's not everything that got picked to go into the issue, but it's a lot of what got submitted. And so a lot of that is by female authors. So I would not be surprised if it sort of trends in that direction. I think white men have a lot to answer for. I think we pretty much suck most of the time, and it's historically we have sucked. And I think one of the things that we as writers can do is sort of take a step back from feeling like we have the answers, or it is upon us to kind of put our feet forward and try to kind of right cultural wrongs or whatever. I think mostly white men just need to shut up for a while and let other people
As you and I sit here talking to each other.
Right. And that's the truth. There is the ideal, and then there is the real, So yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I want to return a little bit to the Boatman's Daughter, because I want to spoil a little bit, at least. I feel like people have had ample time to read Boatman's Daughter, though. By the time I'm talking to Veronica, I feel a little bit guilty, but because her book just hit the shelves. But I am curious about a couple things here, because I mean, it's interesting the way, in terms of the horror here, that the traditional sort of as I'm going to use the term fairy tale, you'll have to forgive me, elements, because I mean, you have witches and things, are also metaphors for other, or could be interpreted as metaphors for the sort of like drug trade business themselves, in their own way. And I'm wondering which of those stories you were more focused on when you went into it. Was it the metaphorical side of a real problem, particularly in the South, around conditions of poverty and the so-called extension of the Nixonian war on drugs? Or is it, were you more interested in writing this fantasy world, and then those social conditions kind of crept in?
I was much more interested in telling a story about these two central characters who are kind of lost children and care for each other and support each other. And I thought, when you look at rural areas and you look at places like that corner of Arkansas, people aren't all turning to crime and drugs. So, I mean, there's a certain sense of just, that is the trappings of the genre that kind of propel the narrative. If you're going to have a crime element in your story, it's not so much that there's an attempt to make a commentary on anything, as much as it is just to inject a bit of energy and kind of venom into the story. But in terms of the fairy tale aspect of it, that definitely was probably more where I was leaning to, because my initial interest came in the combination of place and character. Particularly, I wanted to tell a story about a witch, or at least in which a witch was present, a story. And so I started looking at witches in mythology, and the Baba Yaga was the first one that I thought, this is the one that I want, because there is a very strong sense of, she is earthy, she is of a place, she is rooted in a time and place. And I thought, well, if, let's say you take that and you place that in some kind of magical sort of wood in Southwest Arkansas, where part of the appeal of that area to write about it is that it is isolated, it is separated from the modern world. And so that was more toward that end, I would say, with the fantasy, the fairy tale aspects of it. And the idea of children being lost in the woods, those sorts of things. That was
You do have this like Hansel and Gretel kind of.
A little bit, yeah.
But it's like if Hansel and Gretel were having to smuggle the candy to them.
Yeah, well, the
Did you watch that movie, Gretel and Hansel?
I love that movie. Yeah, that's a director I really like a lot. Osgood Perkins, I believe, is the director, who did The Blackcoat's Daughter, which is, for my money, one of the best horror films made like in the last 10 years. So yeah, I like that movie a lot. It's a very weird, kind of creepy, sinister movie full of things that subvert the notion of magic, which is what I
Mhm.
wanted to do too, is take this idea of magic and make it dirtier, make
Yeah.
it kind of grittier than it typically is portrayed. Um,
Yeah, I'm a big fan of what I call consequential magic,
mhm.
in that it costs something to cast magic.
Yeah.
There was I forget what exactly it was called, but Joseph Fiennes played Merlin, essentially this one season TV show with the Arthurian legend.
Mhm.
But when he would cast magic, like horrible things would happen. Like he's trying to keep this woman alive, and he's holding her head, and like blood is coming out of his eyes and things. And
Mhm.
another time, he has to carve all these runes on his body. And somebody's basically like, "Why do you keep doing it?" And he's like, "Because I like how it feels." And it's just like, Jew. So for me, that was like one of the more horrifying moments, and a thing that's not typically horror.
Mhm.
But I get that too in Boatman's Daughter, is this idea of consequential magic.
Things cost things.
Yeah,
There are consequences, and that you have to give up a thing in order to get a thing. That was a big deal for me. Yeah.
we should have
Um,
demons too.
yeah, and a lot of that is like, I don't come from that tradition, and so as I was reading about these things, I read this gigantic academic work and called The Bathhouse at Midnight,
Mm.
which was all about Russian folklore and Russian magic. And in a way, you're kind of taking bits and pieces of things and you're using them in ways that, as an outsider, I could be getting these things wrong, or I could be um not capturing what is the true essence of a thing. And I tried to be very careful about that, but I also had this idea in my head that I think I gave this something like this in terms of a statement to Iskra, the witch, in the book, which is that she has a mythology in her head that she comes from. She comes from a place where there are names for things. So if we have a forest creature demon, we call it this thing. If we have another demon, we call it this thing. And so my idea was that these things exist here in this place, independent of her. She kind of comes to them as, a person who is drawn there unconsciously, maybe, and then finds herself kind of at this crossroads or this nexus of some power that's really of the earth and the place, and this is where the swamp thing influence kind of creeps in. But but her names for things would be apt, just like, I think in terms of the preacher's cosmology, what Cotton sees about the world, we have names for things. We call a thing a sin, we call a thing, a prayer. She might call it a spell, she might call it, an act of magic, um, or a transaction or something. So that was a big deal to me, was like, this is just the name that she knows for a thing, like the Leshy. That's what she would call it, but that may not be what it is. That's just the way we view the world through that lens.
So was the use of the name Cotton, was that a deliberate reference to Cotton Mather?
Well, no. um
I take it you've been asked that before.
well, no. Actually, you're the first that has asked me that.
Oh, really?
But it wasn't a conscious reference. I think more or less it was just a way of trying to make him sound like he was from the South.
Okay.
That
Well,
he
yeah.
well, and it has a theatricality to it too. Like, this is a name he chose. This is not his real name. This is just the name that he gave himself at some point in the past. Um,
Well, it's interesting
so
because I when I was driving back, I was listening to various things be read to me, and one of the things I re-listened to was Pickman's Model by Lovecraft, and
Mhm.
because it's a nice little short story, and it got me thinking about your use of Cotton too, because one of the things that he says in it is just about Cotton Mather's fearfulness and things in relationship to real sorcery, and
Mhm.
the house he stayed in versus the house he'd be afraid to walk into, and things like
Mhm.
that. And so my mind started wandering back to Boatman's Daughter.
That's nice. Yeah, I was a perfectly deliberate illusion then. No,
As long as no one ever watches this, you're set.
right. um, but yeah, I know I liked the idea that he would just pick a name that sounded Southern and preacherly. Billy, of course, Billy Graham,
Yeah.
Cotton being, the South, Cotton. But yeah, Cotton Mather, that works too.
Okay. You can use that. I don't mind. Now you can have this whole like teleology to it. It'd be great.
Perfect.
Like, yes, well, actually, if you're in the history of horror, the transition here. And you got your beard, you can do the strokey beard.
Oh yeah.
Be perfect. The other thing too, it's interesting. We were talking about the usage of the phrase supernatural itself, and I have to wonder, as a consumer of popular culture, as you've labeled yourself, as a self-confessed nerd. I had to wonder at the time too if like what your opinion would be on sort of like the presence of the actual TV show Supernatural in relationship to pastiche in horror, and also sort of its resurgence of all these different kinds of themes, because you do use a lot of different themes. And I would argue not, since something like Dark Shadows in the 60s and 70s that a TV show, I mean, used so many different horror themes.
Well, again, this is going to be a very disappointing, kind of boring answer. I have seen half of one episode of Supernatural.
That's not much.
And no, it's not much. And it was just enough at the time that I saw it to kind of turn me in a different direction.
Okay.
I have not gone back to it since, although I have become, in the years that have followed, very interested in the fact that it's been so hugely successful and has been such a long-lived series. And I'm a huge Jeffrey Dean Morgan fan, so I should give it a shot.
I mean, it's the first 5 seasons, which is where it was supposed to have ended.
The first 5 seasons,
huh?
I was just thinking, like, life is so.
Well, because it went on for 13 seasons.
Right. And Buffy only lasted 7, and
yeah,
not all of those were good. And
no.
And I was more of a Buffy person, I guess, than Supernatural. Supernatural came at a time when I had just finished Buffy and Angel, and so there was a very much a kind of like, this is my line in the sand, this is derivative. And I say that in complete ignorance of the series.
As I said, the first 5 seasons are worth a shot. But I'll tell you the one that killed me trying to get through, because I used to do this thing at the end of each school year. I would take a week or two and just binge an entirety of something. And I binged all of True Blood in a week. And I have never had something precipitously plummet season by season in my estimation.
Yeah, we watched the first season of True Blood and kind of liked it up to a point. But that came at a time for me, like, when we had just kind of gotten Netflix streaming, and Netflix was getting good. Like, most people don't remember that when Netflix first put their streaming content up, it was garbage. It was basically all the Trauma films. Those were the only really watchable things, and those are terrible too.
Well, it was Trauma films and Doctor Who.
Yeah, Doctor Who was on there. That's right. Doctor Who was there, but there was all this other just like horrible stuff. Like,
yeah, they're all student films too.
Yeah, and it's gotten so much better, but we watched the first season of True Blood around a time where we had kind of started watching other things, and our kind of attitude and opinion was, there's a lot of TV in the world, and it's only gotten worse since shows like Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul have come out. We've only kind of gotten more entrenched in this idea that there's so much TV in the world, we're not going to live that long compared to the number of hours of TV there is to watch. So let's target our audit, like let's watch the things that we really know are good. Like, and you've got one episode to grab us. You've only got one episode. And we got through a few episodes of season 1 of True Blood, and they were really uneven to me. I have a weird I don't know if it's weird, but I have a very kind of persnickety attitude about horror in terms of monsters. Um, I like monsters to be taken seriously. I like monsters to be given their credit and their due for the weight that they carry as metaphors for us, and just they should be scary. And anything that deals with monsters in a way that turns them slightly toward the goofy or the less scary, I'm skeptical of at best. And then at worst, I hate it. So, I think about like, there are wonderful examples of things that walk the line brilliantly with that, like Ginger Snaps, or I think about like that the Monster Squad. That was a favorite movie of mine when I was a kid, because you got all these kind of goofy tropes, but it's really funny and it's also really scary. There are some frightening things in that. And
Yeah, the mummy in the kid's bedroom is.
yeah. Mummy came in my room. The idea that like Fred Decker took that seriously. Like, he wasn't making a send up of Universal monsters. He was making a movie that made them scary in the real world to kids. I love that. I'm less inclined to think of monsters in a cute way, like we have our own canned blood that we drink, or things like that. So True Blood was always going to be a miss for me, probably because of that.
So then what would be your prime example of a scary monster?
Okay. Dog Soldiers. I think about Dog Soldiers. Dog Soldiers may just about be the best werewolf film, and it sits alongside American Werewolf in London, which, again, werewolves are easy to make silly. And that's why we don't have a lot of good werewolf films, is people don't take them seriously. And so you look at a movie.
I'm guessing you're not a What We Do in the Shadows fan.
I love What We Do in the Shadows. I love What We Do in the Shadows.
Okay, I'm just curious.
But that's its own thing. Like, that's kind of like that's sort of a separate kind of love from, like,
it's witty enough, not silly.
Oh yeah, it's brilliant. No, that's a wonderful thing. But even that show in the first season, where is it they have the count who comes to stay with them up in the attic.
Oh yeah, Abanaz.
Right, and he's freaky. Like, they don't try to be cute with it. He's a horribly monstrous, scary thing, and it just so happens to be funny. I'm fine with that. But I think about, like, and again, like American Werewolf in London is a good example of that. That's a great comedy, but there are moments in that film that are terrifying. So I think it's possible to walk that line, and if something doesn't walk that line for me, it kind of fails. So yeah. I'm
trying to remember. I think it's Scare Package that has an interesting werewolf story in it. Are you familiar with that one?
Familiar with that.
That came out this past year. It's an anthology. Okay. And it's got an interesting werewolf story in it. Okay. That starts off a little bit goofy, but then gets darker and darker and darker.
Well, and to me, that's important, is that horror can be so many different things. It can be funny, it can be sad, it can be frightening, it can be fun and scary, it can be an adventure movie. I think about Jaws. Jaws is not only a horror film about a shark, it's an adventure film about three men on the sea. It's Moby Dick.
See, Jaws is a horror movie about local government administration.
Right, there you go.
It is not a horror movie about the shark. The shark is nature. The horror is the mayor.
Well, and that is absolutely my point of view. That gets me into trouble a lot with Goodreads reviews of my books, is that people don't like the fact that the people are scarier than the monsters sometimes. And to me, the people are always scarier than the monsters.
Yeah, the shark was always there.
Hey, he wouldn't have eaten those people if they hadn't gone into the surf, but
yeah,
had to keep the beaches open. So
yeah. So in terms of that then too, have you always been a horror fan?
Yes. I cannot think of a time when I didn't like horror in some form or another. If there was a time, it was before I am capable of remembering it. I always liked scary stories as a kid. I watched scary movies. I used to rent the Universal monster films when I was a kid. You'd go to the video store, you'd rent tapes over and over again. Those were ones that I rented. Um, I think the first horror novel that I read was either it or it was Watchers by Dean Koontz.
Okay.
But there's a great appeal of horror to me. It's and I think when I was writing my first book, one of the things that struck me about it when I came up with the first draft of In the Valley of the Sun before it was that, and it wasn't Honky Tonk Vampire either.
Oh, what was it then?
It was Honky Tonk Man, because I was trying to write a crime novel about a serial killer who preys on women at honky tonks.
Okay.
And it didn't work on the page. Like it was just kind of boring for me. And I realized that the thing that was missing was something supernatural. It was something not connected to our reality, something that is unknown. And so I think that goes back all the way to just the books that I read as a kid and what appealed to me as a reader.
What was the sort of early exposure point where, if you had to think back on it now, the one that you would say, yeah, that one has influenced me sort of long term?
When I was 10 years old, I read Watchers, and I got that book from my mother, who handed it to me and said, you should read this. And so I think there's two things there. One is that book and the nature of the story that's told. It's a story about love and family and nobility, and it's a story about monstrous acts that people commit and monsters that come out of those acts. But it's also connected to the idea that my mother gave me that book, and it was a violent book. It was a book that was scary, but Mom gave it to me and said, you'll like this, read it. So that's a powerful thing too, I think.
What was and we'll stick in the realm of fiction here. What was an experience you've had that sort of sticks with you that actually like terrified you?
When I was in college, no, I was in between college and graduate school. I was driving home late one night. It was about a 50-mile drive from my night class that I was taking to my parents' house. I was still living with Mom and Dad. It was a very wooded, curvy road. Highway 7 in Arkansas is a beautiful road, but certain points of it are just like the middle of nowhere. And I had just turned at a stop sign and was accelerating out of this little small town. And I saw a glimpse of a man behind a tree. And he just stepped out from behind the tree almost at the same point that I got about even with him as I was passing in the car. And it terrified me because he was not there, and then he was there. And it was the middle of the night, late. Why would he be there? What is he doing behind that tree on the side of the road? He's probably peeing, but it was terrifying. And I just remember thinking, like, anytime I think of something scary, I think of that experience, the idea that what frightens you is the unexpected, the thing that you don't see coming, the thing that shouldn't be there, but it is. And so that for me is that's it. Yeah.
It's like the Dan Aykroyd moment, the Twilight Zone, right? You want to see something really scary?
That terrified me as a kid. I remember that. That whole opening sequence is the scariest part of the film.
Yeah.
I mean, even the stuff at the end with the recreation of the William Shatner, John Lithgow thing from the thing on the wing of the plane. That was like the second scariest thing to me, but that opening of that film, it's all downhill from there just because of that moment. Yeah.
So what are you reading right now?
Right now,
not that you're blurbing that you're reading.
No, yeah, I get you. I've
had people show me their stacks of blurb material that has been sent to them.
Fortunately, I'm in between that kind of a stack right now because I front loaded all of that in the spring. And as I was working on my book, and I've been so intensely working on my book that um, I haven't had time to do anything else. And so now I kind of got this cleared schedule of what are you going to read next. And I just today sat down with a kind of weird book that I got from Powell's called The Alien World, the Complete Illustrated Guide. And it's just this kind of bizarre little picture book of um, fantasy alien creatures that this guy wrote back in the like 1980. He created a cosmology of the universe full of aliens, and it has Boris Vallejo art and a lot of fantasy artists in there who did these really cool drawings. So I was just sitting down with that today, and it's one of those cases where the art's amazing and the prose is really hard to get through. So you end up just looking at the art. The next book that I want to read, I just ordered a stack of Penguin classics. People like Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and there's this Michael Ferris Smith book I've got, Rivers. So I don't know what I'm going to pick up next, but it's a wonderful kind of place to be where you don't know what you're going to read next.
What are you looking forward to coming out?
Oh man, I guess Dune. We're excited about Dune. We just watched Werewolves Within recently on streaming. We liked that. Um
What about book-wise?
Book-wise. Oh geez, yeah, book-wise.
Films are fine too.
Films are, well, no, coming out, I always think movie releases.
Yeah.
Stephen Graham Jones has a new book coming out, My Heart is a Chainsaw.
My Heart is a Chainsaw.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
That's in a couple, actually it's tomorrow maybe.
Oh good. Wow. Yeah, I'm so far behind. Even if something comes out that's amazing, I probably won't read it for another 6 months.
Okay.
We just bought Christopher Buehlman's The Black Tongue Thief. It's just too many riches right now, I guess.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to Richard Chizmar's new book coming out.
Yeah, that's
Boogeyman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, he's coming. It'll be on October 1st, actually.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. He's a pretty swell guy, I think. I haven't met him, but I've heard good things about him.
Yeah, I'm always interested in good books coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your super secret stomach ache coming out a year from now? Maybe a title. Yet. We've already got that it's in Georgia. It's set in Georgia.
Well, the title is The Hollow Kind, which, when I was writing the book, I think I Googled books with hollow in the title, and you get like 1,000 books, and most of them just came out. So that, I think that's going to be the title though, because it just makes sense. Like that's the right title for the book, regardless of whether other books have the word hollow in them. So yeah, it's called The Hollow Kind, and it's set in two different time periods in Georgia. One is 1989, and one is kind of the early 1900s to the 1920s. So those two things are kind of parallel to each other, and it's basically about this plot of land that a woman and her son kind of inherit from her grandfather, and they're ill-equipped to deal with what's on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you an 80s or a 90s kid?
Oh, I'm an 80s kid. I was born in 78. So
okay.
The many people talk about Star Wars being the earth-shattering, amazing moment. My wife does, that changed their lives forever. I came to that on VHS. My earth-shattering moment that blew the top of my head off was Batman in 89.
So, yeah, I remember seeing Batman in 89.
Yeah.
That was one of the first movies I saw in theaters, actually.
Wow. I remember the first one I saw in the theater was Return of the Jedi. I think I was 5 when that came out, maybe. I asked my dad, is this going to be scary? And he said, if you're going to start that, we're just going to go home. So I shut up and watched the movie.
Yeah, it one of the first 3 movies I think I saw in movie theaters was Batman.
Yeah, it's great. it's just that formative experience at 11, like I was 11 years old, and that was that age, I think, is the moment when things change somehow. Like your imagination kicks in, you start to become the person you're really going to be. I don't know what it is, but um
Well,
that
since
was.
you're in Georgia, and again, a self-proclaimed nerd, will you be at Dragon Con?
I will not. Dragon Con is beyond me. I think I know people who are going to be there, but that is a level of coordination and sophisticated planning that I do not possess, years in advance planning like that. Dragon
Oh, I didn't know
Con
if you
is
would just go either.
no. I mean, like, just to go, like, you
Okay.
just the logistics of coming to Dragon Con if you don't live in Atlanta, I think are mind-boggling in terms of where do you park, public transportation, the crowds. So we have not gone to Dragon Con. The little agreement that we have with each other is that we will go to Dragon Con when we are invited to go to Dragon Con, which may be never. So
Also, congratulations to your wife. I saw she signed
she
a deal.
did. Yep. She got a short story published and has been setting things on fire lately. So very happy for her. Very
Is there
proud.
plans to team write something?
Maybe down the road. We've talked about it. I don't know what it would be exactly yet. We've kind of kicked our ideas around, but yeah.
Or you could keep up this gaze thing. She could write the male characters, you could write the female characters, and
It's
ne'er the
funny.
twain shall
Yeah.
meet.
Yeah. Well, she's a scholar in her own right as far as all of that goes. She's much more knowledgeable about the male gaze in cinema and horror films than I am. So you know, she would she'd be able to write circles around me with regard to the ins and outs of that.
Fair enough. The last thing I want to ask you is something I ask all the people who come on. Do you have a horror blasphemy for me?
I think I touched on it. I think it was the idea that monsters are funny. I think making monsters funny to me is maybe a horror blasphemy. If you do it, you got to do it well.
Okay. Like what
Yeah.
we do in the shadows.
Yeah, or I think like Fright Night. Fright Night's a good
Yeah,
example
Fright
of
Night's good.
something.
The
Those
original
are
Fright Night.
the original Fright Night, and I have no problems with the remake either. I think both are genuinely scary and also funny. So yeah, there's a balance there. You got to walk it.
I
But
did like David Tennant in the remake.
oh yeah.
I liked that he threw in a Doctor Who. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciated the homage to oneself. And I also just like the idea of him being a Vegas magician.
I think there were a lot of good translations of ideas in that remake. Yeah, the setting
Yeah,
of that was really kind of creepy and scary.
there were some good choices, though I am a huge fan of the original.
hmm hmm
I'm
Yeah.
interested in an idea with that and Nightmare on Elm Street 2,
hmm
just as sort of like coming out the same year and
hmm
both sort of being inherently queer,
hmm
and then sort of like the juxtaposition of the legacies of both of those movies
Well,
around
yeah,
queerness.
yeah, and the legacy of just the Nightmare series in general is ever evolving from movie to movie. Like, by the time you get to what is it? Is it is it Freddy's New Nightmare, or what's
Oh,
the
Wes
meta?
Craven's New Nightmare,
Yeah.
the super
What's
meta one.
the meta one? That's the one I'm
Yeah, that's
thinking
Wes
of.
Craven's New
Yeah.
Nightmare.
By the time you get to that, it's like this is just weird and interesting and like almost academic in the way that
Yeah,
it's kind of parsing out what you've been doing with these films, and
where
it's
you have
kind
the
of
ultimate Roland Barthes moment of the literal death of the author.
right, right, and you're kind of looking forward to what he's going to do next with Scream and those kind of things too. So yeah,
That might be another one of my horror blasphemies. I am not a Scream fan.
hmm oh, so you mean like a blasphemy in the sense of something that other people would find
Yeah, they will
that
find
I
blasphemous that you have said.
oh that okay. Wow.
Yeah, we try to get people in trouble.
Yeah. I want to answer that, but I'm I'm basically a pretty easygoing person, so
Okay.
I don't know, maybe
Is there like a super popular thing you hate in horror?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Probably not.
I mean, I'm not looking for like an edgelord answer here.
No, I really want to give you something, but there may just be no meat there to chew on.
Okay. No horror blasphemy.
No, I mean, mm-mm, mm-mm.
It's funny because when I ask academics, they have a ton.
Yeah,
It's like,
well, and
I almost feel like they try to outdo each other just to see if they can shock me on some level.
yeah, I'm not a person who's fond of like hot takes or things that would get you in trouble. So,
Well, I don't deliberately try to. I mean, I've said a couple of things over the course of the year of doing this. Like, I don't like the Blumhouse films by and large. Halloween 3 is the best Halloween film. I've just said I don't like the Scream franchise, really.
Yeah, well, you're good at it. You should like list all of yours.
I should just have like a bingo card for each time I drop one of these, I feel like.
Well, I will say I've been in the position many times as a viewer, as a reader, of being the one person in the room who liked a thing and everybody else was tearing it
That could be the blasphemy too.
Well, and maybe that is, but just the idea of, I think that's why I'm adverse to the idea of holding these really staunch opinions about things being like terrible. I think there's room at the table for everything, but
sure.
I do think like some things are objectively bad. I mean, there's things that are bad, but I'm not sure that I would think something that's bad is good or something that's good is bad. Sorry. I don't have any good answers.
It's fine. Yeah. I've heard some wild ones, I have to tell you. But like I say, I sometimes, I mean, and it's all subjective anyway. You know, I mean, you talked about The Shining and you talked about the Kubrick version of the film, right? I mean, I think most people like the Kubrick film if they like.
Most people do, and I do kind of get tired of hearing Stephen King run that down, and I would think over the years he would soften on it.
You would, wouldn't you? But he's absolutely not.
Well, okay. I got it.
All right, here we go.
Dr. Sleep. Let's think about any of King's books that you would want a sequel to. The Shining would be one of them. Let's think about the thing in The Shining that makes The Shining The Shining. It's the Overlook Hotel. Let's think about Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining. What did Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, not have? The Overlook Hotel. So that's my horror blasphemy.
I don't disagree with you.
I don't like the ending of Dr. Sleep. I
didn't care for the film in general. So,
well, now I will say the film improves upon the book. So this is a nice kind of juxtaposition of King's opinion about Kubrick's film and his book. And I think what Mike Flanagan did with Dr. Sleep actually makes the book better, because I think even Flanagan knew that the ending of Dr. Sleep as written by Stephen King was less than. And so he takes it and he puts it back in the Overlook, and it's still there. And at least, he gets back to the heart of what is the true relationship that we care about, which is Danny and his mother, not Jack Torrance standing on the steps of the Overlook Hotel waving, which is the ending of the King book. So right. there's my hot take on Dr. Sleep.
Yeah, the whole thing was unnecessary for me personally.
Yeah, sure. I mean, most sequels are. So
yeah, that was the story that was told, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the sequels to The Exorcist too. It's just like,
yeah, which are up and down.
Yeah, 3's fine.
3's good. 3's fun.
I can't believe they're making yet another thing of The Exorcist. I just don't understand why.
Yeah.
But so you'll never write a sequel, I take it. I think we've established that today.
I wouldn't say that. No,
okay.
I would not say that. I don't think sequels are. I think yes, most sequels are unnecessary. I'm not saying all sequels are bad though. So
okay.
Yeah.
Do you think it has to be intentionally set out at the beginning?
No, I don't.
Okay.
One thing I would say that you should not do is try to retro fit your first book or your first movie to be um, like, you shouldn't turn the story in some way that the first book doesn't support. It's the Annie Wilkes thing about, I saw the car go over the cliff. You can't say he jumped out of the car. That's not the way that works. So I don't think you can rewrite something. So I think whatever you do, you've got to pick up and go with where you stopped.
So do either of your books have a future in another form coming up?
Not at the moment. Not at the
Okay.
moment. Maybe, possibly, who knows? These things are fickle. They don't always happen. So it's best not to talk about them until they're actually being in progress. So
okay. Yeah, I've talked a lot with various people. We talked to Amakatsu the other day about it, and she was talking about development hell.
Oh yeah, well but she's like pretty far along, right? You're talking about Red Widow, isn't it?
Well, no, that one's been sort of like expedited. I was talking about the Hunger.
You're talking about the Hunger, which Ridley Scott, I think, bought the rights to it or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been back and forth for a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah,
well,
so we were.
John Horner Jacobs is an Arkansas horror writer, who I think has the best philosophy on this. And he said, "Hey, I'm happy for the check." So, yeah, I don't have an Alan Moore mentality about adaptations of my work.
Oh, geez. Now you really could be stepping into something.
Maybe so.
So, well, I thank you very much for coming on and talking to us. And
thanks for having me. This is fun. I haven't had a nice extended interview in a long time, so this has been fun.
Good. I'm glad you had the time to do it. And thank you all for tuning in with us too. And as always, stay spooky. Thank you for joining us on SunScream. Tune in next time for Spencer Hamilton.